A bottle of ordinary pain relief becomes a doorway to catastrophe. In September 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area die after swallowing cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. The city wakes up to a nightmare, a crime so intimate, inside the home, with a family's medicine cabinet, that it feels personal to every kitchen table and every nighttime ritual. The killer is unseen, the motive unclear, and the only thing certain is fear. The story begins with a whisper in a pharmacy. Someone, somewhere, has turned a trusted product into a weapon. And then the whispers go global, as a ghost of a suspect lingers in every rumor. The possibility that the culprit is someone you'd never suspect, someone you might even walk past on the street. Chicago, 1982. A city of ordinary lives disrupted by an extraordinary crime. We're in Chicago and the surrounding suburban belt, a region where evenings slip into the quiet hum of a factory whistle, a commuter train, and a kitchen radio announcing the latest recall. The Tylenol murders begin not with a grand manifesto, but with a handful of capsules. A simple, everyday product that holds the trust of millions. The city responds with urgency as new reports emerge. Fatalities are communicated through hospital channels, domestic spaces, and private residences. The panic is not just about a single killer, it's about a system that feels vulnerable, packaging that can be tampered with, a supply chain that seems to stretch through every neighborhood, and a public already skittish about corporate responsibility in the wake of a consumer crisis. The victims, composites that honor real families without exposing individuals. To honor the real people behind the headlines while guarding privacy and accuracy, these are composite portraits designed to evoke the lived experience of the victims and their families. The working mother. A woman who balanced a small paycheck, a mortgage, and a kitchen full of little rituals. Pack a lunch, kiss a child goodbye at the bus stop, then return to a house that still smells of soap and coffee. Her death isn't loud, it's intimate, a sudden checkmate in a life of ordinary tasks. The retiree. A neighbor who spent quiet evenings watching the street from a worn chair, a person whose routine felt as unremarkable as the comfortable habit of taking a daily pill to ease pain. The loss ripples through a community that relied on shared familiarity and a calm, predictable arc of aging. The nurse or healthcare worker, someone who spent days comforting others and found solace in small acts of care. Their death feels not only personal but emblematic of a society that depends on caregivers to anchor the fragile, to hold hands when fear loosens its grip. The student or younger adult. A person in the prime of potential, navigating late summer hopes, school, work, plans for a future that suddenly looks uncertain. A reminder that danger can arrive while life is still in its opening chapters. The factory or service worker. A person who moves between shifts, logistics, and the day-to-day work that keeps a city running. Their life is a thread in a sprawling social fabric, vulnerable in ways that feel systemic rather than individual. The backdrop. Tylenol, packaging, and a brand beloved for safety. Tylenol, an emblem of consumer trust, a product built on the promise that a capsule could carry relief, nothing more. Then came a chilling rupture. Bottles deliberately contaminated, tampered with, and distributed in a way that exploited the ordinary channels of daily life. The packaging that once signaled safety, the familiar blue and white labels, the tamper-evident seal that had become a standard of reassurance, now carries a dark memory. The crisis exposes a vulnerability not just in a single batch of pills, but in the social contract between a company, its customers, and the regulatory framework meant to protect them. The investigation landscape, fear, policy, and a race against time. In those early days, investigators confront a mystery that can't be seen in a microscope or proven in a courtroom for months. There are no modern forensics to decode a poison's trace with certainty, no centralized database of pill distribution, no quick way to reconstruct the moment a bottle left a warehouse and found its way into a home. What exists is a web of late-night calls, hospital admissions, and the slow, stubborn march of clues, where the contaminated batches were sold, who bought them, and who, in the immediate moments after ingestion, showed the first signs of poisoning. The public demands answers, the media chase leads, the regulatory agencies scramble to implement new safety measures that, paradoxically, arrive after a fresh crisis. the social fabric, and the ghost suspect. This story isn't just about a killer or a bottle, it's about a culture under stress. The public sense of safety is tied to trust. In companies, in manufacturers, in the system designed to protect them. In the shadows of that trust lurks a ghost suspect, an elusive figure who people fear might be responsible even if no one can prove it. The ghost is not a person in a jail cell but a pervasive possibility. A suspect who could be anyone, a nameless hand that could contaminate a bottle anywhere, at any time. The ghost helps shape the narrative. It pushes journalists to explore every lead, families to watch every bottle on the shelf, and regulators to demand accountability with a zeal that can feel punitive to industry players and innocent consumers alike. Motivation and psychology, the heartbeat of the era. The Tylenol murders force us to look at fear not as a single emotion but as a system. Fear of harm, fear of corporate danger, fear of the unknown. The perpetrator, or perpetrators, emerges through the lens of this era's anxieties. An era where consumer products are intimately threaded into daily life, where trust must be earned anew after a scare, and where the line between accident and intentional harm becomes a battleground for public conscience. And so, we ask, what would drive a person to weaponize a common medicine? The answer in this context isn't a simple motive, it's a mosaic, a desire for control, the thrill of manipulating mass perception, or a perverse belief that a grand gesture of fear will yield some unseen reward. On the other hand, the victims' families live in a quiet, enduring grief that becomes a catalyst for advocacy, policy change, and a reimagining of safety in everyday life. The crime, the murders unfold. We step into a summer that keeps its heat even after the sun has set, where Chicago's streets hum with buses, elevators, and the quiet rituals of everyday life. In 1982, a household staple, Tylenol, becomes a conduit for fear, a seemingly ordinary product that carries an extraordinary danger. What began as isolated, tragic cases soon spirals into a citywide nightmare, a cascade that forces families, doctors, store clerks, and regulators to confront a fragile truth. Trust can be weaponized, and safety requires vigilance as a habit, not a wish. The victims, composites that honor real lives without exposing individuals. To keep the humanity intact while protecting privacy, we present 5 composite portraits drawn from the real tremors of the crisis. The working mother. A woman who kept a careful check on meals, chores, and the little rituals that structure a household. She relied on Tylenol to soothe headaches that come with a busy day of caregiving, job tasks, and the friction of a household budget stretched thin. Her routine, balancing meals, school runs, and a nightly kiss to her children, suddenly dissolves into a phone call from a hospital, a shocked family member, and the long, empty hours that follow. The retiree. A neighbor who spent evenings in a chair by the window, a cup of tea cooling in the saucer, a quiet vigil for the neighborhood's rhythm. The pills were a small mercy, antic to ease the aches that accumulate with time. The moment those capsules become a hazard is a blow not just to her body, but to a life built on dependable routines and the comforting certainty of small daily acts. The nurse or caregiver. Someone who spent mornings in a clinic or home setting, offering comfort, counting tablets, and guiding others through discomfort. The fear that enters her life is doubled. It could happen to a patient she's tending, and it could happen to someone at her own kitchen counter. The student or younger adult. A person balancing school, a part-time job, and first forays into independence. A headache or fever becomes a moment of choice. Take a pill, rest, trust the bottle, until trust falters and the world seems to tilt with the realization that even staples can turn deadly. The factory or service worker. A person who moves through shifts, logistics, and the practical rhythms of a city that never stops. The pill is part of a broader routine, medicine for a long shift, a way to keep going through a week of crowded trains, late arrivals, and the constant grind of making ends meet. The crisis roots itself in the ordinary, revealing how vulnerability scales across a population when a single threat takes hold. The backdrop, Tylenol, packaging, and a brand built on safety. Tylenol has long stood as a trusted emblem of consumer safety, its blue and white packaging a ritual of reassurance. The crisis begins this way. A handful of capsules, purchased in familiar places, drugstores, grocery aisles, and corner pharmacies, are tainted with a poison that alters a life in minutes. The fear is not just about one killer or one moment of malice, it's about a systemic vulnerability, how a product designed to ease pain can threaten life, and how swiftly a city must adapt its trust in the face of uncertainty. The public's faith in a brand, in the tested formula of a bottle, becomes the news's most gripping question. If a trusted product can be weaponized, what else might be at risk in the ordinary corners of daily life? The crime, the moment, and the human cost. The moments unfold in kitchens, medicine chests, and the quiet rooms of homes where children sleep, couples share a late-night talk, and grandparents prepare to tuck into a grandchild. The first sign is a familiar symptom, rapid onset of severe symptoms after ingestion, that becomes a horrifying alarm bell for medical teams. The fear is immediate and intimate. A single bottle on a counter, a moment's inattention, a life altered forever. The victims' families live with the graze of memory, what happened, what could have been done differently, and how to keep faith in a system they're asked to trust again. The investigation landscape, a crisis of trust, not just a hunt. In the early days, the public demands answers faster than science can deliver them. For investigators, there are no advanced forensic tools to trace cyanide in a consumer product, no centralized, real-time shipping database to map every bottle from factory to storefront. What exists is a web of recalls, hospital reports, and scattered tips, each tip a fragile thread that could unravel the whole story if pulled too hard or pulled in the wrong direction. The challenge is not only finding a perpetrator, it's rebuilding a supply chain's reliability, restoring consumer confidence, and understanding how an ordinary acting a capsule for relief could morph into a life-changing risk. The ghost suspect, fear as a narrative force. From the outset, fear generates a persistent, intangible presence, a ghost suspect who may or may not exist in a jail cell or a hospital ward, but who inexorably shapes the story. The idea of a nameless hand contaminating bottles everywhere becomes a framework for journalists, regulators, and families alike, a reminder that danger can creep into the everyday without warning. The ghost helps us explore not only who did it, but how fear itself can become a kind of social toxin, altering behavior, reshaping markets, and pushing for reforms even when the exact villain remains elusive. Motivation and psychology, the heartbeat of the era. The Tylenol murders force us to look at fear as a cultural force, not simply as a personal emotion. The perpetrator, or perpetrators, emerges in a climate where everyday life is intertwined with public health, corporate responsibility, and regulatory oversight. The motive, if there is a motive, is not a single, obvious catalyst but a complex calculus. A desire for control or notoriety, a willingness to weaponize the most trusted household item, and a calculated understanding of how fear can paralyze a population and accelerate policy change. The victims' families navigate a grief that also fuels advocacy for safer packaging, clearer information, and a system that moves as quickly as danger does. The investigation, clues, suspects, red herrings, breakthroughs. We dive behind the scenes of a crisis that unfolded in real time, a city gripped by fear, a brand trusted by millions, and investigators racing to find a thread that could unravel the entire puzzle. This is the work of tracing trust, not just tracing footprints, finding how a tampered pill traveled from a shelf to a kitchen, and whether a single mind or a shadowy mechanism behind it could explain the cascade of deaths. Clue set A, the uttered pattern of the crime. The initial wave. The first patients presented with rapid onset of symptoms consistent with cyanide poisoning after ingesting Tylenol. The pattern was chillingly uniform. A sudden, often fatal collapse in otherwise ordinary settings. The home, the kitchen, a place of daily ritual. This wasn't a random act of violence. It felt engineered to be intimate and terrifying. Timing and geography. The tainted capsules surfaced across multiple Chicago area communities in a short window, suggesting a deliberate targeted act at the distribution level, rather than stray capsules from isolated incidents. Investigators begin mapping the sales and supply chain to see where a batch could have traveled in the days before the first known fatalities. Forensic scent of the crime. Analysts sought a chemical fingerprint in the poison itself, but in the early 1980s, the science wasn't as precise as it would become. The cyanide agents varied in concentration, and the capsules themselves varied by manufacturer and batch. The result? A puzzle where the poison source was harder to pin down than the deaths themselves. Clue set B. The packaging, the tamper, the breakthrough in safety. Tampering as the motive, the core hypothesis quickly crystallizes around one simple but terrifying fact. Someone tampered with widely distributed Tylenol capsules. The same product, in roughly the same form, was transformed into a vehicle for mass harm. Investigators focus on how a tamper could occur without immediate detection across multiple storefronts and distribution centers. The recalls and public health response. Johnson & Johnson moves rapidly to recall Tylenol nationwide. The response isn't just corporate, it's a model of crisis management, public warnings, a recall blitz, and a pivot toward consumer safety that would redefine the packaged goods industry. The core lesson is set in motion here. Tamper-evident packaging becomes not a feature but a necessity, and the likelihood of future similar attacks hinges on corporate transparency, rapid information flow, and regulatory reform. Packaging innovation as breakthrough. The public learns that the seal, the cap, and the bottle matter. The industry-wide adoption of tamper-evident packaging, foil seals under the cap, stronger bottle seals, and later, triple seal mechanisms, emerges from both fear and necessity. Investigators recognize that the era's new safety features could become the case's long-term fix, even if they couldn't identify a culprit yet. Clue set C. The supply chain and distribution network. Store visibility, not just crime scenes. Investigators trace where the tainted batches were sold, which retailers carried them, and how those batches circulated through the supply chain. The challenge is that Tylenol was distributed to a broad network: wholesalers, pharmacies, grocery chains, and independent retailers. A single contaminated batch could seed a handful of incidents across different neighborhoods, complicating the trail. The phantom suspect. A central theme emerges: how to reconcile a lack of a single, verifiable perpetrator with a public demand for accountability. The ghost suspect becomes a narrative device as much as a prosecutorial concern. The fear that a nameless hand could strike again, anywhere, at any time, without warning. The media's echo and public psychology. Early reports highlight bottles with tampering, but the media also accelerates speculation about who did it and why. Investigators must manage not just the physical trail but the narrative trail, the way rumor, fear, and sensationalism can distort the truth and overwhelm the actual crime scene evidence. The suspects and red herrings. Who might have done it, and why it's so hard to prove. James W. Lewis, the extortion candidate who would become the era's most infamous suspect in the Tylenol narrative. He sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding a ransom and asserting he could reveal the killer's identity. He was later convicted on extortion charges related to the ransom demand. His role in the poisonings themselves remained contested and far from proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Lewis becomes a cautionary symbol of how the line between crime and crime prevention theater blurs under the glare of a national crisis. Other named or rumored suspects, and why the evidence didn't stick. The era's familiar public justice pattern produced a handful of rumored figures who could plausibly have tampered with products in the chaos of a large city's supply network. Some were corporate insiders, others were opportunists moving through phony pharmacy channels, and a few were simply misclassified in the court of public opinion. The real danger in these red herrings was not their potential guilt but the distraction from what the data showed. A tampering event that could have occurred at various points in the chain and a lack of a single, verifiable culprit. Breakthroughs and turning points. What finally reshaped the investigation without solving it? The scale and speed of the recall become a turning point. The swift corporate recall shifts the entire industry's risk calculus from post hoc response to crisis prevention, setting new regulatory and market standards. This is as much a breakthrough in public health policy as in criminal investigation technique. The idea of multiple tamper events gained traction. While a single saboteur is not proven, the distribution network's breadth makes it plausible that more than one incident could have occurred through multiple points of tampering. The investigators' willingness to entertain a multi-event, multi-factor scenario preserves the possibility that the case could be broader than a lone gunman or lone saboteur. The pursuit of a credible motive. If a killer existed, motive remains unclear. The mystery isn't only about who did this, but why someone would weaponize a household staple. The psychology of consumer fear, of hidden danger in everyday life, becomes a critical lens for understanding the case's enduring impact. The ghost impact on policy. Even without a solved culprit, the Tylenol case becomes a landmark for risk communication, public health crisis response, and corporate accountability. The investigation's legacy isn't just in names put to the crime but in the safety infrastructure that emerges in its wake. The emotional arc. Investigators, families, and the city. Investigators' burden. The search for a killer becomes a test of nerve, patience, and epistemic humility. Some investigators wrestle with the moral weight of the possibility that justice might not come in a single courtroom verdict, but in the long-term changes to how products are made, packaged, and overseen. Families' grief and advocacy. For the families who lost loved ones, the case becomes a call to action: petitions for safer packaging, better warning labels, and heightened corporate responsibility. The tragedy catalyzes a movement toward consumer protection that outlives the initial shock. Public memory and fear. The Tylenol incident embeds itself into American consciousness as a cautionary tale about trust, safety, and the fragility of everyday routines. The ghost suspect persists as a symbol of that fear, an unseen hand that could, in theory, reach into any kitchen. Twists, foreshadowing, and where the story could go. The what-if of an unproven culprit. The narrative can drift toward a possible but unproven single instigator, or toward a broader phenomenon of dispersed tampering across supply chains. Either route raises questions about how we measure guilt when the evidence is distributed and the primary event, poisoning, occurred across a web of consumer behavior, corporate logistics, and regulatory loopholes. The moral pivot. The Tylenol murders push public interest toward preventive action rather than punitive action alone. The twist here isn't a confession. It's a societal pivot towards safer products and more transparent crisis management, which ends up shaping consumer protection policy for decades. The community, the media, and the aftermath. The Tylenol crisis didn't end with a bottle of capsules pulled from shelves. It seeped into kitchens, living rooms, schools, and boardrooms. It forced a country to rethink trust, safety, and the speed with which a brand, and a city, could respond when the ground shifted under everyday life. This chapter follows how ordinary people, a relentless press, and a reshaped regulatory landscape learned to live with fear, and how those lessons still echo in how we safeguard products today. The community's response, fear rechanneled into vigilance. The vigil of ordinary citizens. In neighborhoods across Chicago and beyond, families began doubling checks on medicines, asking questions at pharmacies, and coordinating with neighbors to monitor common buying spots. This wasn't a panic induced by hysteria, it was a practical redirection of anxiety into protective habit. Empty shelves scanned for tampered seals, and store clerks trained to notice unusual behavior or suspicious packaging. Lodging houses and daily life under a new lens. For households that relied on affordable medications as a convenience, the crisis reframed daily routines. People started reading labels more carefully, keeping medicines in locked cabinets, and teaching children about the importance of not consuming products that seemed unfamiliar or opened. The city's undercommons, boarded-up doors, shared kitchens, and crowded stairwells became arenas where caution grew into a social norm. Family advocacy and community memory. The victims' families, though their names are kept private in many retellings, become the moral gravity of the narrative. Their grief catalyzes calls for safer packaging, clearer warnings, and more transparent corporate behavior. Community organizations and volunteers channeled sorrow into policy-focused activism, not sensationalism. The media's dual role, mirror and magnifier. The press as witness and amplifier. For a public eager for answers, television and newspapers provided a continuous stream of information, speculation, and heartbreak. Reporters chased every lead, sometimes producing breakthroughs that helped public safety, sometimes pushing unverified theories that fed fear and confusion. The best journalism offered context, explaining how tamper-evident packaging would become a standard, and how a recall could function as a learning moment for both industry and consumer. Rumor as a currency. In the absence of a single, definitive suspect, rumors spread like shadows across front pages and talk radio. The ghost suspect, motif, an unseen, perhaps unknowable villain, gave the narrative its haunting through line. The risk, of course, was conflating rumor with reality, a trap the newsroom occasionally stumbled into, even as it aimed to keep the public informed and safe. The ethics of sensationalism versus public service. The media's power to shape perception proved a double-edged sword. Sensational headlines could catalyze action and reforms, but they could also create a climate of fear that overshadowed the real lessons: how to make products safer, how to communicate risk clearly, and how to regulate in ways that prevent repetition. The Tylenol case became a case study in responsible crisis storytelling, not just a crime story. Regulatory and corporate transformation, from fear to reform. The recall crystallizes into a standard: Johnson & Johnson's nationwide recall of Tylenol-labeled products, millions of bottles pulled from shelves across the United States, became a defining moment in crisis management. The company's decision to act decisively, communicate openly, and coordinate with retailers and regulators established a blueprint for future recalls. The episode underscored a core principle: in a crisis touching consumer safety, speed and transparency can preserve trust even as tragedy unfolds. Packaging as shield. The industry's response crystallized around tamper-evident packaging. Foil seals under bottle caps, stronger seals, and a shift toward packaging that would make tampering visibly obvious became the new baseline for over-the-counter medicines and many other consumer products. This is not merely a design choice, it's a governance measure, one that acknowledges a shift in how safety is engineered into the product's first moment of consumer contact. Policy and oversight. The Tylenol crisis spurred a wave of regulatory reform focused on risk communication, product safety, and corporate accountability. While the pace of policy change varied, the underlying momentum was clear: do not wait for another tragedy to act. Governments and regulatory bodies began to codify better recall procedures, faster information sharing, and stricter requirements for tamper-evident packaging across industries. The ghost of uncertainty. The ghost suspect as a narrative compass. A symbol, not a culprit. The idea of a ghost suspect persisted in public imagination. A person or distribution chain vulnerability that could, in theory, reappear anywhere. This figure helped frame the urgency. Even with packaging reforms, the possibility of unseen threats lingered. The ghost wasn't about conviction. It was a reminder that safety is a moving target, constantly redefined by new product designs, new distribution channels, and new forms of deception. The extortion chapter and the limits of certainty. The James W. Lewis extortion case grew from the Tylenol crisis into a courtroom narrative of its own. Lewis was convicted of extortion for a ransom demand, not for the poisoning itself. The distinction matters. It demonstrates how fear can outpace evidence, how the public seeks a single responsible actor, and how the truth can remain stubbornly multifaceted even when the pressure to close the case is immense. Twists, human costs, and the psychological landscape. The victims' families and public health advocates as catalysts for change. Their grief translates into a broader social force: safer consumer goods, more effective risk communication, and a public more attuned to the costs of product safety failures. This shift isn't merely policy wonkery. It's a cultural transformation that reframes everyday life around preparedness and trust. The investigative mindset evolves. In hindsight, the Tylenol murders demonstrate the value of adaptive inquiry. Investigators had to balance the desire for a single, tidy explanation with the reality that the evidence pointed toward a more complex, distributed risk, perhaps an instance of tampering at multiple points in the supply chain rather than a single saboteur. The memory persists, shaping future crises. The Tylenol crisis becomes a reference point for crises in all sectors: how brands respond to threats, how information travels, and how the public's faith in safety protocols is earned back after it's shaken. This memory informs how companies structure crisis playbooks and how regulators design safety nets. The resolution or the enduring enigma. We arrive at the edge of the story not with a final verdict, But with a tempered, hard-won understanding, the Tylenol murders remain one of modern history's most haunting questions, not because every question was left unanswered, but because the answers that do exist shifted the world in ways no courtroom could measure. This is the conclusive arc of a case that changed how we think about trust, risk, and the speed at which a society can adapt to protect its people. The closing facts, what we can know with confidence. There is no definitive, proven killer tied to the Tylenol poisonings. 7 deaths in 1982 prompted a nationwide crisis, but no single person was convicted for the poisonings themselves. The strongest, verifiable legal outcome connected to the crisis is James W. Lewis's extortion conviction, not a murder conviction. The poisonings, in the eyes of prosecutors and historians, remain an unresolved puzzle in the sense that the physical perpetrators never faced a jury for these crimes. A cascade of policy and safety reforms followed. The case catalyzed a wholesale transformation in consumer product safety. Tamper-evident packaging became standard, recall procedures, public risk communication, and cross-agency coordination were overhauled, and the crisis established a template for how companies and regulators respond to threats to everyday life. The ghost suspect persists as a storytelling device, not as proven fact. The idea of an unseen saboteur, an ever-present possibility that danger could be lurking in any bottle, shaped media narratives, public perception, and the psychology of risk for decades. It's a narrative tool that helps explain why fear lingered long after the bottles were off shelves. The human center, victims, families, investigators, and a city changed. Victims as the ethical gravity. The composite portraits you meet in Section 1 carry forward here as a reminder. Ordinary people, ordinary rituals, ordinary trust, all disrupted by extraordinary harm. Their memory anchors the moral of the story. Safety isn't an abstraction, it's a daily, fragile routine. Families as catalysts for reform. Grief became advocacy. They demanded safer packaging, clearer warnings, and more transparent corporate behavior. Their resilience pushed policymakers to codify lessons learned, even when closure in a courtroom never arrived. Investigators as agents of systemic change. In place of a single lock and key resolution, the Tylenol case teaches a different moral. Truth can be achieved not only through a courtroom verdict but through better crisis playbooks, smarter risk communication, and stronger industry oversight. The investigators' work helped redefine how we think about response times, information sharing, and accountability in a distributed, modern supply chain. The city as a living memory. Chicago, and more broadly, the national conscience, carried forward a culture of heightened vigilance about safety in everyday life. The case didn't just alter packaging, it altered everyday behavior. How we read labels, how prompt recalls are issued, how fear is translated into policy, and how a community learns to trust once more after being reminded how vulnerable it can be. Twists, turns, and the craft of storytelling. The unresolved truth as a narrative engine. If there's a twist here, it's not a killer revealed in a courtroom but the realization that truth in a public health crisis can be more complex and more impactful when it leads to preventive progress instead of punitive triumph. The extortion thread as a cautionary tale. The Lewis case demonstrates how fear can latch onto a concrete, sensational hook, a ransom note, while the core criminal act remains unproven on the same evidence. This disjunction between what fear craves and what the data can prove becomes a powerful lesson about how to report and regulate in crisis times. A future-proof memory. The Tylenol murders didn't vanish from the cultural landscape. They evolved into a benchmark for crisis communications and product safety engineering. The ghost becomes a national standard. Never again should trust be placed on a bottle without a visible shield against tamper, and never should information lag risk communication. The ending in a world that keeps watching. Closure by transformation, not confession. The narrative resolves not in a single verdict but in a long arc of reform. The Tylenol story ends with an industry-wide shift towards safety by design, a regulatory ecosystem that acts faster, and a public that expects corporations to put people over profits when danger lurks in the everyday. A continuing question for audiences. If a case remains unsolved in the traditional sense, what counts as resolution? For this investigation, resolution lies in understanding how fear triggers change, how communities recover with slower, steadier trust, and how future crises can be managed with a blend of courage, transparency, and humility. The value of adaptive inquiry. In crisis moments, investigators learn to balance the urge for a single culprit with the reality of distributed risk and imperfect data. The Tylenol case teaches that some truths emerge only when institutions loosen their grip on certainty and embrace a broader, systemic view. The power of packaging and policy. The story's most lasting artifacts aren't the names of people who did or didn't do it. They're the tamper evidence seals, recall procedures, and risk communication protocols that protect millions of people long after a bottle is forgotten in the back of a cabinet. The ethics of memory. Remembering victims with dignity, protecting privacy, and using composites to guard real families are essential ethics in historical storytelling. A true crime narrative can be both gripping and responsible, offering insights without sensationalizing tragedy.